Good evening. My name is Jason Steckel. I'm a prevention specialist with Recovery Resources here in Cleveland. And this is, I think, the second of a four-part series we're doing this spring, talking about embracing parenthood. And this one is about embracing our identity. So we're going to focus on four main things tonight as we go through. And if you've got questions, feel free to jump in, interrupt. I'd rather you do that than wait till the end and either forget your question or whatever. It's better when it's asked maybe in the context of where we're at. But we're going to talk about self-image, and we're going to talk about that for both elementary all the way up through high school. We're going to talk about healthy peer relationships with adults, and then we'll finish up talking a little bit about LGBTQ and anything you might have questions with that. So with that, let's get started. As you can see up on the screen up here, we're not going to go through all of those. There are about 20 different theories of development into adolescence, childhood, all of that. But one of them is Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. We're going to focus primarily tonight talking a little bit about stages 4 and 5. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Erikson. It's just a framework I want to use. But we're going to start with, because some of you here, or some of you watching the video, may have elementary age children somewhere between the ages of 5 and 12. And that is a stage that Erikson would talk about industry versus inferiority. So the focus in that is competency. So if you've got younger children, they're still trying to kind of learn how to do things. That's kind of the focus of that stage of life. And so we'll talk a little bit about that age group first in terms of their self-image development. So some of the things that we see, and I'm going to kind of go through the ages as they develop. These are the typical developmental things we see in these age groups. So ages 6 and 7, they're learning to cooperate and share. They can be jealous of others and of siblings. They like to copy adults. So a lot of times at this age, they're copying whatever they see their parents doing. So all the things that they're doing that are driving you crazy, maybe you're doing it too, and they're just picking up on it. They like to play alone, but friends are becoming more important at this stage. They play primarily with friends of the same gender, not necessarily exclusively, but they tend to. They may still have some temper tantrums at this point. They're kind of still modest about their body. They like to play board games. So just kind of some typical things at that age. As we get a little older, we start to see going to kind of that middle elementary age. You're going to see things like they're going to start liking competition in games more. They're going to start to mix friends, and they're going to play with children of the opposite gender more. So they start to kind of expand a little bit in who they're playing with. Still pretty modest about their body at that age. They start to enjoy clubs and groups more, things like Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, those kind of activities. They begin to move into that phase of those group things. And they're becoming interested in boy-girl relationships, kind of that more, not really the romantic thing yet, but they're starting to gain an interest a lot of times. And as we're going through this is typical kind of average. Realize some children are going to develop a little slower, some are going to develop a little quicker. So there's no perfect, well, if they're not doing these 5 things, they must not be right on track. These are just typical developmental things at these ages. Realize there may be some fluctuation. Every child, every person is different. And then kind of on the tail end, ages 10 to 12, they start finding friends are very important. They may even at this point have a best friend. So that kind of starts developing. I even think about my own childhood. This is about the time I remember first having a best friend. So that's, my experience is pretty typical of this. They're having an increased interest in the opposite gender. So we start to see that happen. They like and respect their parents still. That probably is starting to change if you have anybody that age. You're starting to see that. And they enjoy talking to others. So that's kind of some things that are going on. Some ways that we can help. So how do you help your child kind of in this age of life in terms of expanding their abilities? Setting limits and guidelines, expectations, and enforcing them with appropriate penalties. This is really important at this age. What I see happen sometimes with parents is there's not a lot of pushback quite yet. So they're not establishing boundaries because they're like, well, they're not really. And then the problem is once you get to adolescence and they start pushing back more, that expectation or that boundary has not been set. So when you had a chance to kind of more easily set those things, you didn't do it. Now you're starting to see more struggle. So my recommendation always, even if it doesn't feel like they're fighting you very hard at this point, it's a perfect time to set the expectations. You think about I think an example I'd like to use is like, think about when somebody pours concrete. You know, they don't wait till the concrete's almost hard to start forming it. They put the things down to form it before they pour the concrete. Kind of the same thing here. Put those boundaries in place when they're not as necessary, so that when they become more necessary, that's already an established norm with them. Modeling good behavior. You know, I found as my son is 21 now, but as he was growing up, every time he would do something that would drive me crazy, about 2/3 of the time after I stopped, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's what I do. So, you know, he's modeling he's doing what I'm modeling for him. Complimenting them for being cooperative and for personal achievements. Now again, you want to be careful. This is not, you know, going over the top. But when they do things that are positive, you know, compliment that. You know, look at the things they're doing well and make sure you're encouraging that. And help them choose activities that are suitable for their abilities. You know, so we want, you know, our children to be able to stretch and grow. This is that competency phase. So we want them to fail sometimes. You don't want to make it too easy. But at the same time, we want to make sure they're not trying to do things that are way beyond their abilities. It's finding that sweet spot. You know your child better than anybody else on the planet. And so finding that sweet spot of where they're stretching and growing, but also doing something where they can have accomplishments. You know, one of the things in this phase is you want them to have enough failures to realize life is not always going to be easy or perfect, but you also don't want them so under challenged that they're not growing and developing. So just kind of some important things to think about boosting them. Encouraging them to talk with you and be open with their feelings. I think that's really important. If you can build that expectation at this age to be open about their feelings, as they move into the teen years and they become less likely to share with you, you're not going to change that. That's part of their development. But if we set the expectation and the normalcy that they can come to us with how they feel, they're going to be more likely to still stay somewhat open as they get into that next phase of life. Encouraging them to read and reading with them. Reading is really important. We are getting away from reading, I think, because I'm guilty. You know, we spend so much time on our phones or watching TV. Reading is really important. And so encouraging that, modeling that, and doing that with them. And encouraging them to get involved with hobbies and other activities. You know, with my son at this age, I always tried to get him to try different things to see what he liked. You know, and every family's a little different. Our rule was if you did something, you had to at least do it for that season. You couldn't do it once and quit. But at the same time, if you did it for whatever window and you didn't like it, that's fine. That's how you explore and learn, figure out what you're good at, what you enjoy, what you connect with. Promoting physical activity. Again, video games, TV, all those things, we tend to get kind of sedentary. We don't move around as much. And so encouraging that physical activity, and there's nothing wrong with video games or watching movies or anything like that, but it's all about balance. So making sure there's some physical activity and encouraging self-discipline and expecting them to follow the rules that are set. Again, going back to setting that norm at this point of life about rules and boundaries and all of those things, so that as they get older, they are pushing back, but at least there's some kind of an expectation or norm. Teaching them to respect and listen to authority figures. That's an important thing at that age. Encouraging them to talk about peer pressure, setting some guidelines to deal with peer pressure. As we get into the older phase of childhood, you know, 10, 11, 12, peer pressure starts to seep in a little bit. I work in schools with kids all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. And I see that in like early middle school or, you know, 5th, 6th grade, this peer pressure is starting to become more predominant. Obviously, it kind of hits full steam in middle school. But the more that you're kind of laying the groundwork, again, at this age before that kind of becomes, you know, hits critical mass is really important. Spending uninterrupted time together, giving full attention. We are so distracted as adults. And I think we need to be really intentional about making sure that we're not always talking to our children from over the top of our phone screen or while we're staring at a TV or whatever else. You know, making that intentional time to have that face-to-face, looking them in the eye, giving them our uninterrupted, you know, time. It doesn't have to be all the time, but having those moments where we put the phone somewhere else, where we're not sitting there playing Wordle and, you know, ignoring our child. Well, if you're playing Wordle, you're only going to take a couple minutes. But if you're playing, you know, Candy Crush or whatever it is you might play, not letting that absorb time and ignoring them and not giving them attention. And again, for them, as well as us, limiting screen time. So having those boundaries in place. Because again, that's as they get older, they're going to push back more. The expectations we set at a young age will really help with that. So any questions on that before we move into the next really fun phase of adolescence? All right. So again, to me, a lot of childhood is encouraging, that kind of 5 to 12-year-old range is really starting to set the stage, because at that point, they still, for the most part, respect parents. I mean, they say no a lot, but they're pretty respectful. They still respect authority. They're not really fully at that point where they're pushing back hard. And so that is the point where it's really important, to the best of our abilities, to set expectations, set standards, all of those things before we move into this next phase. So in Erickson's model, the next thing is identity versus confusion. And kind of the word he uses is fidelity. It's a really fancy way of saying this phase of life is where somebody's trying to find their own identity so that they can even accept people who are different than them. And this is a really, and either have teenagers or have had them, this is a really challenging part of life. So there's a gentleman named James Marcia who did this whole identity development, kind of 4 stages. You may or may not be familiar with it. Again, I probably could have listed 10 different models. This is just a framework for us to kind of have a conversation about. Marcia has these 4 different areas, and I'm going to kind of go through each one. It's kind of really fancy language, so I put it actually on the screen so it's a little easier to read and go through. But identity diffusion, identity foreclosure, moratorium, and identity achievement. You will not have a master's in human development by the time I finish tonight, but hopefully you'll have a little bit of information that's helpful. So identity diffusion is kind of that first stage. So it's where it characterizes those who have neither explored options or made a commitment to an identity. So they're almost kind of at the front end. So up till this point, self-identity has not been a big priority, but that is starting to come into play. And I like the explanations better. The little status thing's a little nerdy, but I like the second part. So these individuals don't have a firm commitment regarding issues in question. They're not making progress yet. They're kind of drifting aimlessly with little connection to those around them, or not much purpose in life. And basically what that means is they still aren't really even trying to figure out who they are yet. So this is kind of that first stage as they're moving into adolescence or moving into self-image or self-identity. The next phase is where things get a little more interesting. So identity foreclosure. They've made a commitment to an identity, but they really haven't explored the options. So these individuals haven't engaged in any identity experimentation, and they've established an identity based on choices or values of others. So they have an identity, but it's more based on somebody else's identity. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, it's somebody that they know. Some parents may make these decisions for their children and may not grant them the opportunity. So they might, maybe not intentionally or maybe directly, but kind of pushing an identity on them. In other instances, teens may strongly identify with parents or others in their lives and choose their footsteps. So it usually shows up in one of 2 ways, this phase. Either parents have kind of pushed an identity on a child, or the child is absorbing that identity from somewhere else. So they're looking for an identity, but they really haven't put energy into kind of wrestling with it and figuring it out. The third one is moratorium. So these are ones that are attempting to establish an identity, but they have yet to make any commitments. This is a really interesting phase. So they're exploring choices, but they've not made a commitment. So typically at some point, if they're either taking on somebody else's or it's being kind of pushed on them, at some point they're going to realize that's probably not really their identity. This is that kind of awkward next phase where they're trying to move past that. So they're attempting, but they haven't committed to anything. So exploring various choices. This is kind of that place where maybe you see it seems like they keep changing the clothes they wear, the style they have. There may be all kinds of things and you're like, wait a minute, 3 weeks ago you were that, now you're this, and next week you're that. What in the world? That's kind of this phase where it's kind of confusing. This can be an anxious and emotional, tense time as they experiment with different roles and different beliefs. Nothing is certain. There are many questions, but there are few answers. My experience has been in this phase, the best thing to do, and again, it depends. I'm assuming for a moment when I say this, there's no danger or risk. But to give them a little space and give them some oxygen to kind of figure this out and work through this and be available, be there, but at the same time, they're trying to sort this out. They have a ton of questions. And so sometimes for us, this is a really challenging phase as parents, because we want to try to step in and kind of pull them back to the previous stage, where it's like, you're kind of wanting to, like I said, not maliciously, but you're kind of wanting to try to help them. But giving them some space is really important in this phase. And then the last one is identity achievement. So they have made a commitment. They've kind of decided what their identity is. They have a coherent, committed identity. And again, the important thing is this last sentence. It's a long process and not usually achieved by the end of adolescence. So when they get to identity achievement, it doesn't mean they're done, but at least it means they've kind of sort of figured out their identity. But that's going to be an ongoing, if we're honest for all of us, it never really ends. But typically that arch goes a little bit past adolescence into probably your mid-20s, some people mid-30s, but typically, early to mid-20s is when that plane starts to land. But that's the kind of the last part of that, is now they're figuring out, okay, this is who I think I am, or they have a pretty good idea of their identity. So any questions on all of that identity development stuff? All right. So I want to talk a little bit about how to have a healthy relationship with your teen as a parent. And we're going to talk a little bit about dating, about friendships, and about relationships with parents and caregivers. First of all, when we're talking about relationships with their peers, there's a couple things we want to watch. So healthy relationships. And as parents, especially with teenagers, I think our goal is more to be close enough that we can mentor and offer advice. But as we've talked about already, they're now at a phase where they're trying to figure some of this out. So we're more kind of watching and observing and providing, some kind of feedback. But these are some things to watch for. So if you see your teenager in relationships, and these are I'm just talking about even friendships, but also dating relationships, but some things like mutual respect, trust, honesty, the ability to compromise, individuality. So everybody, nobody forces their personality or who they are on other people. Good communication, anger control. These are all things you want to watch for. So typically I encourage parents, as much as possible, be around your teenagers. Be the place where people are welcome to come if you're able or comfortable to do that. You don't want to always be, as they would say, you don't want to always be up kind of in their business. But at the same time, be around them when they're around their friends as much as possible, even if it's from a distance. Maybe it's observing when you're at a sports event, or, like I said, having them over, or whatever. You don't want to go to everything. You want to give them their space. But when you have opportunities, observe how their friendships are. Or if you can get them to talk about it, maybe, get them to talk a little bit about those relationships. Some other healthy things, fighting fair. And again, these apply to every age, but adolescence is really where some of these, for the first time, they're learning to do this on their own with peers without adults being as involved. Problem solving, understanding one another, self-confidence, being a role model, and if they're in a sexual relationship, having a healthy one. And there's a lot of unhealthy things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So some unhealthy things. And again, I'm all about giving our young people space, but there are times where if we see major red flags, trying to find delicate ways to have those conversations. Again, you don't want to march into the room and be like this, because all that's going to do is probably push them further away, and they're going to be like, la, 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 and they're not going to listen. But finding, here's the thing I found most helpful. I was a youth and family minister for 14 years too, so I spent a lot of time with teenagers. And one of the things I've always found is one of the best places to have a conversation is in the car. Because you're looking forward, they're typically looking forward or at their phone. And when you're not looking face to face, sometimes they'll say things that they wouldn't say if they're looking you in the face, because they don't feel as intimidated. They feel a little more, I don't know if safe's the right word, but they don't feel as directly like you're looking at. And sometimes something will slip out and you'll be like, oh, well, this is a good conversation. Let's talk about this. But some things to look for, to listen for. If you hear these things going on in whether it's a dating relationship or a friendship, any of this stuff is really important to maybe find a way to have some kind of a conversation, or maybe direct them to talk to another adult. One of the things I tell the high schoolers, especially high schoolers and middle schoolers that I see every week in schools, is find 2 or 3 adults that you trust, because I know that as you become, I was one of those people for the students that I had in my youth ministries, but as you go into middle school, high school, sometimes you don't want to talk to your parents. That's part of the development process. But have other adults who you trust, who you think are wise, who you can respect, and have somebody you can talk to. Even when you're like, I don't really want to talk to my parents about this, okay, have that other adult, school counselor, teacher, coach, whoever it is. Find those people. So these things like control, if somebody's controlling a relationship, manipulating, if there's hostility, if there's dishonesty, if there's disrespect, if there seems to be some kind of a dependence in that relationship, if there's intimidation, if somebody's intimidating somebody, especially if there's physical or sexual violence. Obviously, those severe cases, I think no matter what, it's important for us as parents or adults to step in when it gets to that level where there's some harm or some really serious consequences that could come out of it. Obviously, the higher the harm, the higher the possibility of some serious harm coming, the more that we may need to intervene a little more directly. But again, yes?
Does this relationship thing also apply to like parent to kid?
Absolutely.
Peer to peer?
No, I would say absolutely.
Caregiver too?
Yeah.
Like you want to be careful of these things as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is going to be really any relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about parent to teen, but yeah, when we look at all of these things, they're going to manifest differently in a parent-child or an adult-child relationship. But absolutely, all of these things, there are some situations, not anything that's inappropriate here, but at some extent, as a parent, you have some control over your child. So it's going to look a little different, but if that's a manipulation kind of control, that's not healthy. But obviously, as a parent, you have some kind of authority over your child as long as they're still in your home. But yes, in general, these should also be red flags if they're happening in a parent-child relationship, for sure. It's a good point. So a couple other things. There's a little chart here I'm going to kind of show you. This is from the CDC, from their Healthy Youth. But just to show you some of the things that are going on that our young people are dealing with, 17% of students have considered attempting suicide. 19% have been bullied in schools, and 14% misuse prescription pain medications. So because of that, one of the things we talk about, if you look at this middle section, the importance of school and family connections. Adults who experienced strong connections as youth were 48 to 56% less likely to have mental health issues, experience violence, engage in risky sexual behavior, and use substances. So we as adults have a responsibility to have those kind of connections, because we can see, looking at people that are adults today, the impact that these things had on them as young people. So, having those strong connections are really important. Some other things on the right there, schools can implement positive youth development programs. A lot of schools are doing that. That's part of what I do in my role as a prevention specialist, going into schools and helping. Parents can have frequent and open conversations. I think that's really important to, as much as possible, keep those lines of communication open with your young people. They're not always going to talk to you. Have those other adults that they can connect with. But as much as possible, keep that door open in your relationship. And then providers can discuss relationships and school experiences. Like your family doctor, people like that also I think are an important part of it. Some other things, so relationships for adults with teens. So this kind of going to the next thing. Some other things, communicate open and honestly, including your values. So, it's important, I think, we share our values with our young people. And sometimes they're going to disagree with our values, and that's okay. They're figuring out who they are. We talk about the different phases as they're, and you may find when they're in kind of that moratorium phase, their values and views may change 1 week to the next or 1 month to the next. They may strongly believe X, and 3 months later, they strongly believe Y. And their development phase, that's part of what they're going through. But our being able to communicate open and honestly helps them feel hopefully a little more comfortable. Supervise adolescents to facilitate healthy decision making. So, we want to give them space, but we want to be present. We want to, supervise doesn't mean you're following them around everywhere looking over their shoulder, but helping them learn how to make decisions. And we talked a little bit about the last, back in January, we talked more about like how the teenage brain works and all that. But to revisit that really quickly, in those ages between about 12 and 20, the whole prefrontal cortex is kind of rewiring. So decision making, sometimes parents are like, well, why didn't you think about that? Well, because physiologically, sometimes their brains aren't even wired yet to think as far ahead as we do. So sometimes we have to help them make those decisions. So kind of help them think through things. Spend time with your adolescents enjoying shared activities. So they don't want to be with you all the time. However, find those opportunities where you can do stuff together. Maybe your family likes to play games together. Maybe you learn, maybe I'm not a big video game fan, but my son loved video games. I mean, I loved video games when I was younger. I don't play them so much anymore. But I would sometimes play video games with my son just to have that time together, that shared connection. So sometimes you may have to do something you don't love to have time with your child. Now again, to be fair, sometimes they've got to give a little bit too, but we've got to have that space where we can spend time with them. Become engaged in school and help with homework. So I always encourage parents, find ways to volunteer or be involved at school. Doesn't have to be all the time, doesn't have to be hours and hours and hours, but maybe it's chaperoning one event, maybe it's driving to something, maybe it's helping serve food, maybe it's working at a concession stand, whatever it is, find those opportunities to be engaged in school in some way. Again, not all the time, not everywhere, but at some level, and help with homework as much as they'll let you, just to stay engaged. Again, volunteer at their schools, same thing, and then communicate regularly with teachers and administrators. I talk to administrators and teachers all the time, and one of the things they wish was parents would talk to them more. Not just call them when there's a problem, but have ongoing connections. Again, it's not like you're having coffee with your principal every week, but have some kind of connection with your school administrators. That also will help if something comes up. It's just like with your teenager. If you've already got an existing connection with your with your teachers, with your administrators at your school, then if some kind of a problem arises, you've already got an existing relationship. So that's definitely something that is very helpful. Any questions on that before we kind of jump into the last segment of what we're going to talk about tonight? All right. So the last thing we've kind of talked about self-image, we've talked about relationships with peers, relationships with parents. And as we're talking about identity, the last issue we want to talk about a little bit tonight is around the areas of LGBTQ. So people have a lot of questions. So I'm going to go through just some basic things, cover a few points, and then I'll mention again at the end, if you've got more questions, next Thursday, I think it's LGBT, I think, or LBT, I can't remember the exact letters. I can look when I'm done. But Cleveland has an LGBT, I think it's an LGBT center. They're actually having an open house next Thursday. They're located over, I believe, on the east side or west side of Cleveland. I can look all that up. I'll look on my phone when I'm done. I know I'm going next Thursday. But that's another place maybe if you want to learn a little more about what's available or what's going on out there. So I'm going to hit 4 basic points. We're going to talk about sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression. I am not the world's expert on this, and I realize there's this is always kind of evolving. So I'm thankful for the center for some information that I got from them that's helped me put this together a little more clearly. So LGBT, it's on the bottom of the slide. So first is sex assigned at birth. You may or may not have heard this before. So this is when somebody's born, they're born with certain anatomical parts. And there are basically 3. There's female, there's male, and then there's other or intersex. So there are people that are born with organs for male and female. About 2% of the population is born with both. They might have, what we would call male parts on the outside, female on the inside. They might have a mixture, but about 2% of the population is born intersex or some other, not exclusively male or not exclusively female. So, but when we hear that language, it talks about how a body is when somebody is born. The next one is gender identity. There's a lot of terms here. Some of them overlap quite a bit. Some of them are very similar, but people use different ones. Anybody familiar with like the terms trans and cis? Anybody familiar with that? So the difference between trans cis with men and women is a cis man is somebody that was assigned male at birth and identifies as a male. A trans or transgendered man is somebody that was assigned female at birth, now identifies as a man. Trans and cis women is the same thing, just the opposite. So if you hear cis male or cis female, that just means somebody's gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. And if it's trans, it would be the opposite. Questioning, you may have heard that phrase. That's somebody that isn't sure. They're questioning their gender identity. Gender queer just means that it doesn't align with traditional norms. It's kind of more of an umbrella word. Gender fluid and non-binary are similar, but it just means that they don't identify with a traditional male or female, man or woman. And then agender is, again, a little different term that they don't identify at all as any gender. So just some different phrases. Again, they all kind of can overlap a little bit, but have a little bit different nuance. So any questions on any of that? All right. Sexual orientation. So I'm assuming the first couple of words on the top, most people recognize. Gay means, traditionally it's used with men, although it can be men or women, but it is a man that's attracted to another man. Straight is somebody man that's attracted to a woman, or a woman that's attracted to a man. Bisexual is somebody that is attracted to both men and women. Could be a woman or a man attracted to men and women. Lesbian is a term used for women who are attracted to other women. Queer is, again, a little bit more of a blanket statement. For a long time, that was really a derogatory term used towards folks who were bisexual or gay or lesbian. But the LGBTQ community has kind of pulled that word back and decided to use it as a positive way, and it's more somebody that doesn't identify, when it comes to sexual orientation, with the traditional straight. So it could cover a lot of these different categories, but that community has pulled that word back and kind of taken it and made it positive as opposed to the derogatory term that it was for a long time. Questioning, again, is somebody that maybe is not sure of their sexual orientation. They're still trying to figure it out. Pansexual is a newer word. So what that means is typically, and again, there's even some debate within the LGBT community, but pansexual more means you're attracted to pretty much, you can be attracted to anybody regardless of gender. So you may say, well, what's the difference between bisexual and pansexual? A lot of that comes down to, especially when within the community, if somebody is attracted to like a trans man or a trans woman, whereas bisexual typically, again, these words are still kind of evolving, but typically bisexual will be cis men attracted to cis women or cis men. The pansexual is a little more broad, so that's kind of the difference. And then asexual is just somebody that's not attracted to anybody. So those are kind of the different sexual orientation words. Any questions on any of that? All right. And gender expression. So you may hear some of these words, you may not. Some of these are probably more familiar than others. The first two are more with males, masculine, feminine. So kind of self-explanatory, but masculine is a man that acts masculine as opposed to feminine. Butch and femme are basically the same words, or mean the same thing, but they apply to women. And then masc is just kind of a abbreviation of that. Queer, again, like in the other categories, it's a little more, it's an umbrella term. Cross-dressing and drag, you might think, what's the difference between those? Great question. Cross-dressing is more somebody chooses, like it's a man that chooses to dress as a woman or vice versa, in their everyday apparel. Drag is more of a performance. So if somebody's doing drag, it might be a man that dresses as a woman, but he does it to perform. He's doing it at a show or on the stage, whereas cross-dressing is more of your everyday, somebody that chooses to dress that way in their everyday life. Does that kind of make sense? Because I know some people ask me, like, what's the difference? Aren't those the same thing? They're not the same thing. I am all done.